Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar training on an overview of the Model Battery Energy Storage System Law. My name is Carolyn Clocker, and I am the Environment and Energy Program Leader at Cornell Cooperative Extension in Dutchess County. Tonight's training, as I'm sure many of you already know, is the third of 4 trainings that are part of Dutchess County's Opportunities in Renewable Energy Training Series. These trainings are being provided in partnership with NYSERDA, the Hudson Valley Regional Council, and Cornell Cooperative Extension, Dutchess County, as part of the NYSERDA Clean Energy Communities program. Previous sessions included a Clean Energy in Your Comprehensive Plan training and an overview of the Model Solar Law training. And our final session, which will be in person at the Farm and Home Center on June 14th, will actually be a nice follow-up to tonight's topic, as it's going to focus on battery energy storage for first responders. And it will provide an in-depth overview of New York State's uniform code requirements relative to battery energy storage systems. So if you're interested in that training, or would like to learn more about the past sessions that have already taken place, you can check out the URL that is currently up on the screen. That's where you'll find out more information about each of the, someone is saying no audio. Is there anyone else having problems?
Carolyn, I can hear you. I've heard.
Okay, great. So Richard, I'll try to troubleshoot with you later then on what might be going on after I get the introduction underway. But as I was saying, if you're interested in that particular training, the follow-up training to this one, or seeing information, including the slides and the resources that were shared in the previous 2 trainings, please feel free to check out the URL that's on the screen. So as we all are likely aware, New York State has set ambitious goals through the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to reduce the state's carbon footprint and improve the resiliency of communities across New York State. So we thank you all for attending tonight's training so that you and your communities can be part of the solution to move our communities and New York State as a whole forward towards a clean energy economy, while also learning how to best manage these shifts to renewable energy in your communities. Before we get started on tonight's topic and turning the floor over to our presenter, I just wanted to review a few housekeeping items. Just as a reminder, this training is a webinar, which means attendees are automatically muted. If you have questions for the presenter, please feel free to add them either to the chat box or the Q&A feature on Zoom. There may be times when we can actually ask the question during Jennifer's presentation, but most questions will likely be held to the end of the training, where we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. But please note, if you have a question that comes up during the presentation, I'm going to be monitoring the chat all night, and we'll make sure to save any questions so that we can get to all of them at the end. I will also be doing my best throughout the evening to add any links and references that our presenter shares throughout her presentation. But please note that in about a week's time, all of you will be receiving an email that will include a link to the recording of tonight's training, a PDF of the slides, as well as a list of those links and references that are shared throughout the evening. I also wanted to share a few quick thank yous before we get started, including a thank you to the Dutchess County Planning Department, who organized tonight's training in the series of trainings for you all, especially Shelby Frank. I'd also like to thank Carla Castile of the Hudson Valley Regional Council for supporting this particular series, as well as the clean energy community initiatives in the Mid-Hudson region. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Hudson Valley Regional Council, they are NYSERDA's clean energy communities contractors for the Mid-Hudson region, and they provide communities support to implement clean energy actions, save energy costs, create jobs, and improve the environment. They're a fantastic resource, really amazing to work with. And so if you haven't worked with them yet, I highly encourage you to reach out to Carla and her team. And later on, I'll add their contact information and their website in the chat box. And finally, I'd really like to thank Jennifer Manera and Bill Oberker of the NYSERDA Clean Energy Siting team for being our amazing presenters throughout this entire series. As previously mentioned, tonight's training series provides an introduction to land use and zoning considerations for battery energy storage systems, as included in the Model Battery Energy Storage Systems Law, a resource that is part of NYSERDA's Battery Energy Storage Systems Guidebook for local governments. Saying that multiple times is a huge tongue twister. So our presenter for this evening is Jennifer Manera from NYSERDA. Jennifer is the program manager for the Clean Energy Siting Team at NYSERDA, where she helps guide local government officials through best practices and appropriate local laws and permitting procedures for solar, wind, and battery energy storage. And prior to leading the Clean Energy Siting Team at NYSERDA, Jennifer was also a project manager on NYSERDA's communities and local government team for many years. So thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that you can take over. And we really appreciate you being here tonight.
Happy to be here, and thank you for hosting. It's so much easier to reach a large number of people and get this information out there when we have help. So thank you again. Are we all good seeing nothing but a slide right now? Perfect. All right. So like Carolyn said, I'm Jen Manier, and I'm a program manager at NYSERDA on our Clean Energy Siting Team. You'll see this same contact info a couple times throughout this presentation, I think, but cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov is the best way to get hold of our team. It's not a black box. It sends an email out to every single person on the Clean Energy Siting Team. So whoever's least busy at that particular moment will do their best to get back to you as soon as possible. So feel free to reach out anytime. So a brief agenda. I'm going to go through an introduction to battery energy storage systems in general, just sort of how they're built and what the different components of them are, and then go into just a high-level overview of New York State goals, programs, and policies. If you've attended some of our other workshops, a little bit of this is going to be repeat information, but we always want to make sure to include it for those who have not been attending every single one. And I guess a refresher never hurts as well. And then finally, I'll get into some of the details of the battery energy storage systems model law. We're not going to walk through every single word of it verbatim. This information is dry enough as it is. I'm not going to sit here and read a law to you, but do know that, you know, it's on our website if you want to look into every little detail and more after the fact. And then I'm also going to dive into fire safety issues associated with energy storage a bit as well. And I think some of that information will be repeated in your final battery energy storage for first responders workshop that's coming up in a couple of weeks, I think. But again, that's the sort of thing that you can't hear it too many times. So I hope that the high level stuff that we touch on for fire safety tonight will be reinforced if you're coming to the next energy storage workshop, and you'll get more detail even on top of what we covered tonight. And then, like Carolyn said, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, although if she sees a more urgent or time-sensitive question coming through, I'm happy to be interrupted and answer questions throughout as well. We're not that rigid. Okay, so just for those of you who are not familiar with the Clean Energy Siting Team at NYSERDA, our role is to work with local governments all across the state to help you prepare for renewable energy development in your communities. A lot of communities and towns in particular, I think, are seeing some, larger scale development for the first time, may not have zoning codes, on the books or really understand the technology or how to deal with it. And that's what our team is here for. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, the 4 different guidebooks for local governments that our team has produced over the years. In the bottom left, it's the Battery Energy Storage System Guidebook for local governments, which we'll be talking a good amount about tonight. Over to the right, we have a wind energy guidebook, working counterclockwise back up, the solar guidebook for local governments. Probably more of you are familiar with that one. It's been around the longest and has the most amount of information and chapters in it. If you're not familiar, highly recommend you take a look. And then the newest addition to our collection of wonderful guidebooks is Clean Energy and Your Comprehensive Plan. I know many of you probably attended that training already. If you haven't, I think there's a recording of it. available, but that's like I said, it's the newest edition. For many years, we heard from local governments that they didn't know how to go about incorporating clean energy into their comprehensive plan. And of course, it's very important to do that before adopting a solar or battery energy storage system law. It needs to, you know, reflect what's in your comprehensive plan. So we put that guide together, and I hope if you haven't taken a peek yet that you will. All of those resources are available on our website, which is on the bottom left-hand side of the screen here, just nyserda.ny.gov/siting. But also, if you just Google NYSERDA clean energy siting, we should pop right up to the top of the search results. We're pretty easy to find. And again, there's that email address, cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov. So that's what our team does. In addition to putting those guidebooks out, we put on workshops like this as well. We're also available for one-on-one technical assistance. You can call us up. We're happy to come out and meet in person, you know, if warranted. And meet with your planning board, just anything you need. We'll try to be there for you and help as much as we possibly can. And for the things that we're unable to answer or unable to help with, we'll try to point you in the right direction. So in summary, don't hesitate to reach out. Even if you think it might be far-fetched, we're going to do our best to help you. That's what we're here for, and it's free. All right, so without further ado, we'll get into the brief introduction for battery energy storage systems and just an overview of the technology itself. So when we're talking about energy storage, we're talking about potential energy. So the conversion of kinetic, electrical, or other forms of energy to potential energy. So taking the energy, converting it, storing it for future use. Some examples might be electrical, gravitational, mechanical, thermal. You can see some images on the screen here of some batteries that look very familiar to you, perhaps the AA lithium batteries in the top. But also you can think of battery energy storage. Dams do the same thing, right? They're storing energy, and then when you need it, you release the water, it spins turbines and creates electricity again. So lots of different types of energy storage. This slide highlights some of those types a little bit more. So pumped hydroelectric, not just dams, but pumped hydroelectric. We have at least one example of this in New York State, where when their power is plentiful and or cheap, you can use it to essentially pump water up to a higher geographical point, store it up there. And when electricity becomes more expensive to produce, or you need more of it for whatever reason, you can release the water from that reservoir to spin turbines and generate electricity. So that's a form of energy storage. A couple examples of mechanical might be compressed air energy storage, sort of similar to the pumped hydro that I just talked about. There are ways that you can pump air and compress it into an underground cavern or some other vessel and store it for future use. And when you need it, you release the air, it can spin a turbine, generate electricity. You're starting to see a theme here. I won't go through every one of these in detail, but for the most part, we're going to be focusing on electrochemical energy storage, which is what you typically think of as a battery. And even within that, there are multiple different types of batteries: lead acid, lithium ion, so on. There's also flow batteries, which are like liquid based, not something you might be as familiar with, but lots of different types of batteries. Within all of these energy storage types, like I said, we're going to focus mostly on electrochemical because it's what you're most likely to be seeing and dealing with. And even within that, I would say our primary focus tends to be on lithium ion batteries in particular, because they're most prevalent right now. And again, what most local governments are seeing come before them for permit applications. All right, so covered this a little bit already, some of the different types of electrochemical makeups, the different things batteries can be made out of. Essentially, it gives depending on what chemicals you use in them, it gives them different properties. But for all battery energy storage systems, they're gonna have the same essential building blocks for the most part. And again, mostly talking about lithium ion here. So you have the cells here on the left-hand side, which are what you would typically think of as your batteries that you might have in your remote, your cell phone, your car even. Those would be a little bit bigger. And when you string a bunch of those cells together, moving over to the middle image, you have what we refer to as an energy storage module. And if you string a bunch of modules together, you have a battery rack. This is just another way of looking at it, the cells, the modules, the rack, but this image is kind of nice because it shows you some of the different shapes that those cells can take. So the typical cylindrical cells that many of us are familiar with, but they can also be prismatic or even a pouch shape. They're all great, slightly different properties. I'm not an engineer. I couldn't tell you every nitty-gritty difference between them, but just know that they're all there. String a bunch of batteries together, you have a battery energy storage system, essentially. I mentioned before that lithium ion is sort of dominating the market at this point, and try not to get too overwhelmed with this chart. I realize there's a lot on there, but it's essentially just showing why lithium ion is dominating now over some of the other potential battery types, right? So just starting on the top row there, they have a pretty high round trip efficiency. The duration for what the amount of energy they can store, like how long they would be able to push energy out for, maybe not quite as long as some of the other types, up to about 4 hours or so. And they can even be more than 4 hours too, but this is typical. A little bit less, but still a pretty good duration. You don't often need it for too much more than that. The time to build for all of these different types is right around the same amount of time. However, in the middle here for the operating cost, you see that lithium ion has a low operating cost, which is very important, right? We want to be able to provide these services cheaply. So low operating cost is great. Another thing that sets them apart in the next line down, the space required, they have a very small space required. You can pack a lot of energy into a very small space with lithium ion batteries, which is great. Cycle life right around sort of average with the others, and the technology maturity for lithium ion batteries is up there. They're very highly commercialized. So when you add all of that up, you can kind of start to understand why lithium ion is starting to dominate the market for battery energy storage. There are a couple different types of ways that these systems will interconnect, right? So we have the smaller residential and commercial systems, which are typically associated with a building whose load they're serving. So a residential battery energy storage system is going to push power, back into the home that it's attached to when that energy is needed. Same is true for a commercial system. And we'd refer to both of those as behind the meter or on the customer side, because they have this direct tie to a meter that's serving a specific building and a specific load. And that's how they're sort of treated in the electricity markets without going into too much detail. On the other side of things, front of the meter, if you will, quite literally located in front of a meter, or on the utility side, we have the much larger energy storage systems, which are taking electricity out of the grid when it's not needed or when there's an excess, and storing it until it is needed and pushing it right back out onto the grid, just like any power plant might do. And those electrons can kind of just go wherever they're needed. These larger scale utility energy storage systems are not associated with a building or a load in particular. And you can see the difference in size is quite stark. The residential system might be the size of a large suitcase. Commercial system, maybe a refrigerator or a few refrigerators together size. And utility, we're looking at shipping containers full of batteries, or even in this case, in this photo, multiple shipping containers for scale. We went through the building blocks of an energy storage system a couple slides ago, the cells, the modules, the racks. The one additional thing all these systems are going to have, it's not just batteries strung together, and that's it, put energy in, take it out. They're also going to have a battery management system. And these systems they can monitor all the way down to the individual cell level, even in those larger utility scale systems, and make sure that all of the individual battery cells are operating within the proper temperatures and things like that, so that nothing will go wrong. And if something does go wrong, maybe one of those little cells overheats, it can flag that, send off an alarm, or shut down and isolate that specific cell. Or if it's a whole module that's been affected, shut that down and isolate it until the problem either is fixed, or if not, you can remove that part of it and do some maintenance and replace it with cells that are functioning properly. So this is the eyes, the ears, the brains of the energy storage system. And even the residential level all the way up through utility, they're all going to have this, monitoring the system to make sure it's working, setting an alarm if it is not working properly, and also even taking action to correct any problems on its own, even without human interference in some cases. So primary land use and local considerations for all these different technologies that folks are seeing come up, solar, wind, energy storage in particular. All of them are going to have location and zoning considerations. You're going to want to think about where in your community you'd like to see them or not like to see them. They'll have different environmental impacts to consider. Decommissioning is always a popular topic with any of these solar, wind, or energy storage. What happens to the equipment at the end of its useful life? So all of those are considerations, and we'll cover that later on in here. And also taxation. How do you tax them? What's an appropriate way to assess them? We often get asked for help figuring out what an appropriate pilot might be for some of these, or a payment in lieu of taxes. These are, considerations that are applicable across the board, but they also have many of their own, unique considerations as well. So solar, for example, has visual and aesthetic impacts that tend to be of interest to folks, right? Solar can take up a lot of land, and that might change the view for some people as you're driving by, or the view from your back porch. So the visual and aesthetic impacts of solar are a big concern for many. And also because it can take up a lot of land, a lot of acreage. There's also agricultural land impacts to consider when you're looking at zoning for solar as well. You don't want it competing with farmland too much. It's not completely avoidable, but you want to sort of pick and choose and make sure you're trying to save your best farmland and things like that. Wind also has visual and aesthetic impacts. They're a little different from solar. They don't take up as much acreage, but you can see them from farther away. So it's sort of a different way of looking at it and planning for it in your community. Wind has sort of a unique noise consideration as well. The spinning turbine blades can make sounds as they're going past the tower that's holding them up. So you want to make sure they're sited, far enough away from a residence so that the people living there don't have to listen to that sound. And you can do noise studies and determine where that noise will or will not occur. Shadow flicker, also a concern for wind. That's not a concern for these other technologies. Again, as those turbine blades are spinning, if the sun is behind it, it can cause shadow flicker. So again, you'd want to see studies ahead of time based on where the turbines are going to be located to make sure they're not casting annoying shadows, on someone's back porch, right? Different considerations. Energy storage in particular has fire safety considerations that solar and wind may not have. And that's just, we're packing a lot of energy into a very small space. Things can heat up. The battery management system does a great job of preventing these incidents from occurring, but it is definitely a consideration that is pretty unique to energy storage. And building off of that, incident management training for first responders is, of course, absolutely critical to make sure that, in the unlikely scenario that battery management system fails, or, something goes wrong that was unanticipated, and God forbid, first responders do have to respond to an incident, that they know how to handle it. Many are probably not familiar with how to deal with a shipping container full of batteries. So that training, battery energy storage for first responders, that we'll be doing in a couple weeks, goes into a little bit more detail about how things can go wrong, all of the safety measures that are in place to prevent things from going wrong, and high level what to do for first responders. If there is a fire in one of the systems, how do they go about managing it? So very important. One thing you might be wondering is, why are we even talking about energy storage to begin with, right? So it's going to play a pretty important part in the grid of the future. And I think this slide here does a decent job of just sort of showing how all of the pieces fit together. So on the left-hand side, in the top left, you see all of your intermittent renewable energy resources, solar, wind, hydro, sort of feeding into the grid, or perhaps even feeding directly into a battery energy storage system there, sort of in the middle. And on the bottom left, you also have your traditional energy generation sources pushing energy out onto the grid and being stored in battery energy storage systems until it's needed. And the batteries can go directly into a home in the case of those residential systems, or behind the meter systems, as we discussed before. Or if you follow that longer arrow under the bottom of the house, the battery energy storage systems, if we're looking at one of the utility scale ones, can be pushing energy directly in and out of that grid over on the right-hand side of the screen, which also is capable of, pushing energy back into the home too. So it's a little bit circular. You have your renewable energy resources feeding into the grid, feeding into the home, or they're feeding into energy storage, which is then feeding into the home, and so on and so forth. And the easiest way, I think, to understand why it's even necessary to have this energy storage, although there are many reasons, and we'll go over a few more of them in the coming slides, but the easiest way to think about it is the sun. The sun doesn't always shine. So the solar panels are not always producing electricity at the exact moment that you need to use it. Store it for later, for when you do need it. The same is true with wind and other intermittent sources. However, there are many other great reasons for it as well. This chart may be a tiny bit overwhelming. Don't feel like you need to look at every single thing that's on here. I'll try to explain it high level for you, but there are different sort of groups that can be served by battery energy storage. So customer services, so like residential and commercial buildings have certain uses for battery energy storage that might be a little different from utility services and grid services, like keeping the grid in balance at all times. So this chart here just tries to show all of the different services in the white part around the outside ring there that energy storage can provide. And the very outside, the orange, the green, the blue, is showing where those services are, providing a benefit. And as you move into the middle of the circle here, that darker red in the middle are showing the benefits in white that apply to the transmission grid. And then that brighter red ring that is bigger, more of the energy storage benefits can apply to the more localized distribution grid. And then finally, that lighter pink ring, sort of in the middle-ish of the circle, like halfway through the middle and the outside, behind the meter. So, the residential and commercial services. So just looking at some of the services that it can provide, starting at the top left, I guess, around like the 11 o'clock hour, backup power. A fairly obvious one for a residential application, if you will. You can use a battery energy storage system in lieu of a generator for your electricity needs, rather than having a fossil fuel powered generator. You might be interested in battery energy storage system and not create any emissions, right? So there's that. Moving over to maybe the 10 o'clock mark, it can be increased PV self-consumption. So if you have solar panels on your roof and they're making more energy at a given time of day than you need, you can store that excess power in your own on-site batteries to use later on at night when your panels are no longer generating energy. So you can be a little bit more self-sufficient, I guess, in that way. Moving over to about like between the 9 and 10 o'clock hour on this chart, demand charge reduction. Some larger commercial buildings are charged according to their demand. So if they wherever their largest demand for electricity is at any point in the day, there's a fee on their bill, basically, that they have to pay more based on like the highest absolute time that they're using the most amount of energy. Some commercial establishments can reduce that demand charge if they look at when they're going to be using the most amount of electricity or have the highest demand, and supplement it with battery backup that they charge during one of their lower consumption times and reduce that demand charge. So lots of different uses for it. It's not always just the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing when you need it. Lots of other benefits here as well. And these next few slides here, I guess I got a little bit ahead of myself and tried to go through this on the previous one. So I'll skip through this here. Yeah, so they can also help for utility services, to defer costly upgrades to the utility distribution and transmission infrastructure. It can be hard, it's harder to move electricity longer distances. And so if you can get batteries strategically placed on the grid in different places, it can potentially defer some costly upgrades to make sure that we can get electricity where it needs to go. It can mitigate congestion in areas where there's either a lot of generation or inadequate transmission capacity. They can help fill in those gaps. Energy arbitrage. I talked about this, I hinted at it a little bit a couple slides ago, but it's basically charging when electricity costs or demands are low and then discharging when it's high. This can also reduce curtailment of renewables, which is basically sometimes you have to scale back a solar system because there's too much electricity already on the grid. It doesn't have the capacity to accept all of the energy that system is creating when it's really sunny out. So that system can have, an on-site battery, for example, that the PV system charges until the grid can handle that additional electricity going in. And many more. I won't go through every single one of these because I feel like I'm going into too much detail right now and I don't want to keep you here all night, but definitely feel free to, review the slides when they go out after the fact. This one example is actually nice to go through though. So peaker plants, when the grid is operating, we have base load power plants that are essentially running sort of all the time at a fairly high capacity, just generating electricity that goes wherever it's needed. And for the most part, that serves our needs. But on those, really hot summer days when everyone's turning on their air conditioning and they're, people are still at work, but also people are coming home from work. So the lights are on in both places, the air conditioning is on in both places. That's a time of peak electricity demand on the grid. And the way we've traditionally dealt with it is through gas peaker plants. They'll only fire up when needed for these short windows of time, call it between like 4 and 6 p.m. on hot summer days. The problem with gas peakers is that they are typically only operating at about 80% of their capacity, and they have minimal operational limits. You can't just run them at a very low threshold, right? Their utilization rate is low. They're only turned on to meet peak demand or emergencies, like I was describing, those super hot summer days. They can take a few minutes to ramp up and dispatch them. And in the meantime, they're standing by, they're costly to maintain. And also, and when you're running them, they have greenhouse gas emissions associated with them, among other pollutants, right? Energy storage can function as peaker replacements. And rather than running at 80% of capacity, we can think of energy storage as working at 200% of capacity. And that's because it has the capacity to act as supply or demand. It can take power off the grid when there's too much of it, and it can put power back onto the grid when there's not enough of it, again, like at these times of peak demand. It also has a high utilization rate. Some of those slides that we just went through showing all of the different benefits of energy storage to different customer bases. So it's not only serving as a peaker, but it has all of those other simultaneous grid services that we saw on that pie-ish looking chart. They can be dispatched in seconds rather than minutes, like the gas peakers. And when they're standing by, they don't have any costs. They're just sitting there, not much cost to maintain them, and there's no direct emissions from them. So they're a really great option for replacing fossil fuel fired peaker plants. All right, as promised, an overview of our New York State goals, policies, and programs that are driving a lot of the demand for renewables and consequently energy storage systems as well. We have some pretty ambitious goals that were outlined in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, some of the most ambitious goals in the country, I believe. 70% renewable electricity by the year 2030 and a 100% emissions-free grid by 2040. You can see the chart down at the bottom shows the current electricity mix, or the electricity mix over time rather, from 1980 to 2017. It's a lot to take in, so I'll draw your attention to one example here, that dark orange red, which is second from the bottom. Nuclear has made up a fairly big chunk of our energy mix up until now. And as many of you may know, the Indian Point nuclear plant came offline somewhat recently, certainly after 2017 when this chart ended. So that thick orange line there is going to actually get, or already is, if this were updated, more narrow. And we have to make that up somehow. And one of the ways we're going to do that, in addition to just trying to reach our goals, we need to supply of the electricity we need. The bright green band in the middle, which is renewables, is going to have to expand pretty drastically in the coming years, not just to make up for, nuclear coming offline. That's one example, but in order to meet these electricity sector goals. And it's a pretty big change. You'll notice if you look back to the 80s and 90s and follow this chart across, the thickness of that green band hasn't changed a whole lot since then up until 2017, but it will be changing a whole lot in the coming years as we start to accomplish these goals. And we're already pretty well on our way. If you break them down a little bit more into some technology specific goals, we're looking to get 10,000 megawatts of distributed solar by the year 2025, 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by the year 2035, 1,500 megawatts of energy storage by 2025, and 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by the year 2030. And that first bullet up there, 10,000 megawatts of distributed solar, the original goal was 6,000 megawatts. It was recently upped to 10,000. And we already have, I think, about 6,000 or very close to it already in the pipeline and secured. So might as well ramp that goal right up to 10,000 and keep going. Snapshot here of the solicitations that NYSERDA puts out every year for large scale renewables. It's competitive. Essentially, developers will propose large scale projects to us, wind, solar, hydro. Sometimes they include energy storage, sometimes they don't. And if the projects are, well sited, they have all of the land leases secured and they are cost competitive and you need the energy there. There's a whole lot of factors that go into deciding which projects are awarded. But if they are awarded, NYSERDA will sign a contract with the awarded projects that essentially say, if you build this project, we will pay you for the renewable energy credits that they generate once the project starts producing energy. So this is just a snapshot of one of the solicitations from the 2020 solicitation, the awarded projects. Mostly solar. This particular year also had a hydro project, and there's some wind in there as well from other years. Okay, so our New York Sun initiative, for anyone who's not familiar, this slide probably needs to be updated in the pretty near future to reflect that new goal of 10,000 megawatts. But anyway, it's a $1.6 billion initiative to help support solar. So this is basically the program that funds any of the residential, small commercial, community solar sized systems. It's non-competitive, first come, first serve sort of formula incentives for installing solar, either on homes, commercial buildings, or like I said, community solar, which is just for scale, anything up to like maybe 30-ish acres or so. Unlike the large scale renewables program, which you're looking at projects that are larger than 30 acres of utility scale size, if you will. Just a little bit more about our energy storage initiative. So much like the New York Sun program is funding solar projects, we have an energy storage program as well that has been funding energy storage projects, both residential, commercial, and utility scale. It's a lot of the benefits we've sort of touched on today already. We're avoiding emissions associated with traditional like peaker plants, for example. It can reduce the impact of power outages. It allows intermittent renewables to be available during times of peak demand, like we mentioned before. And also, we're creating a lot of jobs. And this initiative in particular is estimated to create 30,000 jobs by 2030 in New York. NYSERDA has put $400 million behind it so far. And we also have technical assistance, some of which you're experiencing right now. And I went through these goals on a previous slide and showed the 3,000 megawatt by 2030 goal, but we're expecting that to potentially increase up to 5,000 megawatts soon. And just another context slide. This map just shows where some of the energy storage projects that are receiving NYSERDA incentives are. They're basically all over the state, with a little bit of an exception for the Adirondack Park. That tends to be the case, but otherwise there aren't too many regions where you're not seeing them or where you won't see them anyway. Okay, so permitting in New York State for clean energy in general is going to vary based on the size and on the type of installation. So for solar and wind projects that are less than 25 megawatts, they're going to be permitted at the local level through seeker and whatever municipal requirements you might have on the books. For projects that are larger than 25 megawatts, they're going to be permitted at the state level. If they've been around a while, they might be going through the old Article 10 process. Any new projects are going to be going through the new Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which was just created a couple of years ago to essentially speed up the process and outline a more appropriate process too for renewable energy systems in New York. Article 10 was originally designed with fossil fuel power plants in mind, and it just sort of incorporated renewable energy projects. It wasn't really designed for that. It also was not designed for us to meet our state goals in the time that we need to meet them. So Office of Renewable Energy Siting was created, and rather than taking 3, maybe 5, possibly 6 years to be permitted under Article 10, the new Office of Renewable Energy Siting is permitting projects within 1 year of receiving a complete application. So summary, projects less than 25 megawatts permitted at the local level, greater than 25 megawatts going through the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, most likely. And projects, there's this funny gray area for projects that are between 20 and 25 megawatts, where they can opt in to the state level siting process or be permitted at the local level. For energy storage, if the energy storage system is paired or co-located with a large scale renewable generator like solar or wind, it would be permitted at the state level along with it. If it's an energy storage project that is not paired with an energy generator, it will be permitted at the local level regardless of how big it is. So very important either way to get a local law on the books for energy storage, which is what we're talking about tonight. So I mentioned before that all of the guidebooks, including the energy storage guidebook, are available on our website for you to download anytime you'd like. This is just a screenshot of what our clean energy siting team's website looks like. Over on the left-hand side of the screen, you see all of the different guidebooks and resources that we have. So you can just click in there and you can download individual chapters or the entire thing all at once, depending on what you're looking for. Our contact information again is there, and there's also an online form you can fill out if you want to request technical assistance. It's absolutely not necessary to do that, although you can. Sending us an email is more than adequate. You can also join our email list there if you want as well. Okay, so digging into the law a little bit more. So our guidebook here has 4 different chapters. The battery energy storage model law is one of them. It's the first one. There's another chapter that is the battery energy storage model permit. For those of you who might be familiar with the unified solar permit, hundreds of communities in New York State have adopted the unified solar permit, which is basically just a streamlined permit for smaller systems to not make them jump through tons of hoops and to make it easier on you to issue permits. That was successful. So we developed a similar model permit for battery energy storage systems. Again, this is really just supposed to be covering those smaller, maybe residential, small commercial systems. There's also a battery energy storage inspection checklist is chapter 3, and that's intended to help your code officials inspect those smaller systems that were permitted along with the model permit. So really trying to make it easy for those small systems to get through and take all of the guesswork out of it. Finally, chapter 4, we included an excerpt of the section of the fire code that pertains to energy storage systems in particular. I know it can be hard for folks sometimes to access the actual code documents. So we took out the energy storage section, made it a chapter in the guidebook. Everything's right there, freely available on our website for you to peruse. Fire code maybe makes for some really nice bedtime reading if you're having trouble falling asleep. But we're going to be focusing mostly on the model law today, and I think we'll touch a little bit on the fire code as well. This is a little bit of a repeat slide from what I said before, but just remember, large systems permitted at the state level, smaller systems permitted locally, and then this funny 20 to 25 megawatts can go either way. And that's for the renewable generators. Battery energy storage, where if it's being permitted, if it's paired with a renewable generator that's being permitted at the state level, it gets permitted right along with it. But if it's standalone, no matter how small or how big it is, it's going to be permitted at the local level. All right. And I promise we're not going to read through every word of the model law. It's already a little dry. I'm really hoping to not put you to sleep, but this is just an outline of everything that's included in the model law. Authority, just showing, demonstrating where you get the authority to adopt the law from, a statement of purpose, definitions, applicability, general requirements that apply to all energy storage systems, regardless of size. And then really the meat of it is section 6 and section 7, which are the more specific permitting requirements for energy storage systems based on the size. So tier 1 being smaller systems, tier 2, larger systems. We have a section on safety, permit timeframe and abandonment, enforcement, and severability for the law. So we'll touch on it a little bit here. This is an excerpt of the authority section, basically just saying where you get the authority to adopt this as whichever type of local government you happen to be. You'll see throughout the model law, there are sections that are sort of grayed out in brackets. All of that is saying, you must edit this part, insert, name of village, town, or city here, or you're, choosing the proper authority here. It's fairly straightforward, but wherever you see gray in brackets, definitely edit that part, or otherwise it won't make sense. But for every other part of the law, we encourage you to edit it as you see fit as well with your lawyers. We have a Word version of it available on the website, so you can just download that and edit every word or letter in there as you see fit. But the gray bracketed sections we call out as must edit, basically. So skipping right over into section 3, definitions. Some of I think the two most important definitions in here are how we're dividing the storage systems up for their permitting requirements. Like I said, tier 1 is going to be those smaller systems. So they have an aggregate energy capacity less than or equal to 600 kilowatt hours. And if they're indoors in a room or enclosed area, they also have to be only a single energy storage system technology type. Tier 2 systems are either larger than 600 kilowatt hours, or if you're mixing more than one battery type in a room or enclosed area, we would consider that tier 2 as well, just in case, because you want to explore any potential interactions between the two chemistries. Just some more images to give you scale and context for what these systems look like, how big they are. The two on the sort of outside side of the screen are residential systems. They might be, again, a suitcase, maybe a couple suitcase sizes. And the two in the middle, commercial systems, maybe the size of a refrigerator or multiple refrigerators. But all of these that you see here are going to be, less than 600 kilowatt hours in tier 1 in the model law, which is essentially going to be a slightly less intense, more streamlined permitting process because they're smaller. There's less concern of safety risks, essentially. Tier 2, they're all going to be much bigger, but even within tier 2, the scale can vary pretty widely. So over on the left-hand side there, you see a relatively small tier 2 system. And over on the right-hand side of the screen, still tier 2, but way bigger, multiple shipping containers full. So I mentioned a second ago that the smaller tier 1 energy storage systems are going to have a slightly more streamlined permitting process because they're smaller, you're not so concerned about them. We recommend in the model law that the permitting requirements for tier 1 be that model battery energy storage system permit that I was talking about, which is a streamlined approach where you just sort of insert the name of your community in there, use the inspection checklist for your code official. And regardless, these systems still have to meet all of the applicable requirements of the fire code. That's, of course, true across the board. In section 7, we go through the tier 2 permitting requirements for these larger systems. And in the model law, we recommend requiring a special use permit and doing site plan review. And again, of course, they have to comply with all of the applicable sections of the fire code. This is a little snapshot of the energy storage system model permit, again, for those smaller tier 1 systems. It actually doesn't cover every single tier 1 system, but all of those that are, I believe we go, and maybe we did put it up to 600 kilowatt hours, never mind. But basically it's all set up for you and you just fill in the blanks for your individual community. So we pulled out a small section here and just blew it up. So enter the amount of the permit fee that you want to require or your valid payment methods. There's not a whole lot that you need to edit here, although of course you always can if you want to. We already have the form set up for you. for folks to fill out, just indicating, is this going to be a residential use or a commercial use? How big is the system going to be? The capacity rating of it? What battery type is it? So just a nice clean form for you to collect all the information that you'll need for it. And then submittal requirements in the end. So we lay out like the minimum plan size. We ask them to put the applicable codes on the cover sheet, et cetera. So everything you need essentially to permit a tier 1 system should be included in here for you. And it just kind of takes the guesswork out of it. For tier 2, the larger systems, of course, it's going to be a little bit more comprehensive. There's more that can go wrong with the larger systems. So you want to be very certain that everything is in order before you permit it. So in the model law for tier 2 permitting requirements, we lay out over on the left-hand side of the screen here, it's showing the process for approval that's laid out in the model law. You'll choose which zoning districts to permit the systems in. You'll fill that out in the model law as you see fit. And we have a suggestion that applications would be reviewed for completeness within 10 business days. Seems reasonable. If you don't think that's reasonable, change the number of business days for what you think your community can commit to. That's true again throughout the model law. It's edit as you see fit. Take it or don't take it. It's just advice. I won't go through every little bit of that, but just know that it outlines the process for approval there. And then more of the detailed and nitty gritty, the requirements for approval. So all of these sections over on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see as you go through the model law, it talks about utility lines and electrical circuitry, signage requirements, lighting requirements, vegetation and tree cutting requirements. And we'll go through some of these in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. But like vegetation and tree cutting requirements, for example, we're saying like, don't plant very combustible vegetation right up against the battery energy storage system. That is not good. Maybe you don't want folks cutting down trees to build one of these. So you can limit the types of trees that they can cut or where. And we have recommendations in the model law for how to go about doing that. Noise requirements, decommissioning requirements. Again, always one of the biggest questions or issues that comes up is what happens to these at the end of their useful life. So we outline what to do for decommissioning. There's site plan application requirements in there, special use permit standards, and what to do in the event of an ownership change for the system. All right, doing decent on time, I think here. So we'll dig in a little bit more into that decommissioning section that I just mentioned on the previous slide. So as part of the application, you're going to want to require a decommissioning plan, outlining what the anticipated life of the system is, what the estimated cost to decommission the system in the future will be, how that estimate was determined, a method of ensuring available funds for the decommissioning and or restoration of the system if it needs to be repaired. We recommend requiring a decommissioning fund. It's not super necessary, I don't think, but it tends to make folks feel a little bit better about it. Developers and system owners are making money off of these systems. It's in their interest, to keep it going and to be there for the life of the system. So it's highly unlikely that they're going to, skip town and leave the community on the hook to decommission a system at the end of its useful life or in the middle of its useful life. But in the very unlikely scenario where that could happen, a decommissioning fund can protect the town so that you have a pot of money to fall back on should it end up falling on you for whatever unlikely reason. We also recommend back to the decommissioning plan on the left-hand side of the screen, keeping the decommissioning costs current. So you might want to have them update the estimated costs every year because these things change. And describe how the system will be decommissioned and the site restored to its original condition at the end of decommissioning, the end of the useful life of the system. Okay, so digging in a little bit more into the site plan application that I mentioned was a requirement a couple slides ago. We just outline in the model law everything that should be a part of that. So property lines, physical features of the site, any proposed changes to the landscape, grading, vegetation, etc. It should include electrical diagrams, spec sheets for the equipment, contact information for the installer, owner, operator, zoning district designation, a commissioning plan that they're going to follow to make sure that the system is working properly before flipping the switch on, a fire safety compliance plan, an operation and maintenance plan, etc. And skipping down to the emergency operations plan, you'll notice that that's highlighted in bold, just like number 9, fire safety compliance plan. I think those are both some of the most critical components of this when you're looking to permit an energy storage system. We talked a little bit earlier how for energy storage, one of the most unique considerations for it is the fire safety of it. So you really want to make sure that it's a good fire safety compliance plan, that they're doing everything that they absolutely needed to do according to the code. And I think almost even more importantly, perhaps number 13, the emergency operations plan. What do first responders need to do if something goes wrong? And even before the first responders, how is the system owner going to deal with things should they go wrong? What's their plan for emergency operations? What is their plan for perhaps training the first responders before turning it on? And also, what should the first responders do in certain situations? Very important. Okay. So that was just a super high level view of what's included in the model battery energy storage system law. Again, if you open it up, it's a lot more detail. Really trying not to put you too asleep tonight. So now I'm going to get into what I think is kind of some of the more fun stuff, the fire safety. And this is what I was saying might be a little bit of a repeat or an appetizer, maybe, if you will, for the course that's coming up in a couple weeks here. Before we get into it, I think this might be a good time to take any burning questions from the first half, or maybe we take, I don't know, Carolyn, if you were interested in taking like a 3 to 5 minute rest break, or I can keep going.
It depends on how you feel you're doing for time. Based on where you are in your slides, I think you're doing great, but so there has only been one question that's come in, and it's related to safety. So I'll share it with you now, but you may be presenting on some of the questions. So Michael asked early on that, and he started off by mentioning that he's heard of significant concerns about the safety of these facilities. How safe are these systems? Is there a long enough track record with these facilities? And should they be kept far from residential areas?
I will be covering some of that. And yeah, you're not the only one who's heard, significant concerns about the safety of them, right? We're packing a ton of energy into a very small space. Things can go wrong. But a couple years ago, we saw that concern and shared that concern as well. There have been examples of energy storage systems, particularly the larger ones, catching fire and sometimes even exploding. And I think I'm going to walk through an example of that later on. But the best thing I can say about it now is that New York has one of the most stringent fire codes in the country for battery energy storage now. And at one point we were absolutely leading. I have to assume that some other states have followed suit at this point, but honestly, I haven't kept track of what the other states are doing, but I'd be surprised if no one has followed suit yet. We ended up skipping a couple code cycles a couple years ago, I guess, at this point, because we weren't so concerned about them. And the fire code at the time did not address adequately anyway energy storage systems. There was maybe like a page or so of how to make these systems safe, and it just hadn't anticipated the scale of the systems that were going to be installed. There is an entire chapter now, many pages long, dedicated to all of the little things that need to be done to meet the fire code and keep these systems safe. And while there may be some examples out there of incidents that I don't know about, the incidents that have happened that I do know about, where there were first responder issues, or there was an incident in Arizona where one of these larger systems actually did end up exploding. And in most of those cases, and in that case in particular, it was built to an older code that didn't have all of the fire safety protections that our current code has. And the first responders were not adequately trained for how to respond to the situation. Had they been adequately trained, you never know what could happen, but had they been adequately trained, I don't think what happened in Arizona probably would have happened in Arizona. So I feel pretty good about where we are now as a state with this fire code in effect all across. Everyone has to abide by it no matter where they are, with the exception of New York City, who's adopted their own version of it that is, equally good. As far as, is there a long enough track record? I don't think I'm in a position to say what a long enough track record is, although I do know that we've learned a lot of lessons from things that did go wrong and applied those lessons to, what we're doing now, getting first responders trained, having a very strict, very robust fire code for these. So yeah, there are concerns, but they're being addressed to the best of our abilities. I think there are always going to be risks with any type of system that has, fuel or energy involved in it. And I think we've gotten to a point where those risks are calculated and acceptable and pretty safe at this point. Should they be kept far from residential areas? I don't think it would be appropriate to put the larger utility scale systems, right in the middle of a densely populated residential area. And that's where it makes a lot of sense for, go through the model law and you designate which areas in your town you want to allow these larger systems. But even if you didn't, if they're complying with the fire code, there are certain setbacks within the fire code that they have to be from property lines, from buildings, from combustible materials. So a lot of those setbacks are already built into the fire code itself, even if you were not to address it in your zoning, which you totally should address it in your zoning too.
Great, we've got another question added. We've got a question now from Paula in the chat. Do all even yard or roof systems have at least some battery energy storage system?
Not necessarily, no. So you're talking, do all solar systems have battery?
That's what I was
not
assuming.
Necessarily. Nope.
Yeah, Paula, if
either way.
You're asking differently, please let us know in the chat. Great. I think that's it for questions at this point. And unless you need a break, I'm inclined to continue, and maybe we end a few minutes early for folks. If there's
That's fine by me. We'll plow through and see where we end up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah. Okay, so talked about, I probably covered a lot of this in the answer to the one question in the last few minutes, but we'll repeat some of it. So for energy storage systems, there are a bunch of different codes that apply. These all sort of work into the New York State Uniform Code. So there's the fire code, building code, the residential code for the smaller systems, and also the National Electric Code. And all of these apply to energy storage systems. So just know that. And again, a lot of the stuff I'm going through now is going to be covered in more detail in the energy storage for first responders, but it's really hard to talk about the law without talking about the fire safety stuff too. So like I said, New York ended up sort of skipping a code cycle back in 2019 because we shared those same safety concerns and knew that the code at the time did not adequately address them for energy storage. So we worked with our friends over at Department of State to adopt an emergency rule back in, I think it was April of 2019. And then that supplement was eventually, fully incorporated into the code in May of 2020. So we saw the need, got an emergency ruling in place to get the stricter fire code in there, and then went through the more normal processes to get it fully implemented. So it is now applicable across the state. No localities need to adopt it on their own. It's already there. Great, really happy about this, and yeah, kind of proud of it too. Took some action when we saw the need. So fire safety, this is what everyone's concerned about, right? So sorry, I'm in the office and people are waving through the window. They're still here working hard. So the main concern with lithium ion batteries in particular is typically thermal runaway. So what is that? It happens when the batteries are abused in some way. It could be some sort of short circuit, messes with one of the cells. There could be thermal abuse. Maybe it's super hot wherever the batteries are, and maybe the air conditioning's not working for some reason. So somehow they start heating up from an external thermal source. Or it could be physical abuse. Maybe the fencing was broken around it, and a car drove into one of those larger systems and sort of pokes one of the batteries and has physical abuse and damages the cell in some way. So cell damage, battery abuse. When that happens, the cells can start to heat up a little bit, and then off gas as they're heating up. And from there, it's sort of a cycle where it's just heating and off gassing. And if it's not stopped in time, then thermal runaway starts happening, and the hotter it gets, the hotter it gets. And that's what we're referring to as thermal runaway. And the cells might start heating up the cells that are directly adjacent to them. And then that process starts in the cell directly adjacent to it, and it heats up the cell next to it. And you get the idea. So that's what we're talking about when we refer to thermal runaway. This is the main concern with lithium ion batteries in particular. So you follow this chart around from like the 12 o'clock position, following it clockwise. Batteries abused in some way, shape, or form. The cell's damaged. It starts heating up and off gassing, and also releasing some of the heat. If it goes unchecked for too long, you might start seeing smoke. And if that goes unchecked for too long, it might actually ignite and catch fire. And if it's catching fire, it might, just like the heat from one cell might spread to the next, the fire can spread from one rack of batteries, perhaps to a rack of batteries that's next to it. And that's propagation going down the line if it's not contained. So this is what happens if we don't have any checks and balances in place, right? And this right here is just sort of an image of that thermal runaway that I was talking about. So you have perhaps a cell that's damaged, it starts overheating, it heats up the two next to it, moving down to the number 2 row there. They start heating up, and so on and so forth. And honestly, one of the best ways to deal with this once it's already happening is water. You got to cool them off and stop the overheating process. It's going to ruin the batteries, but that is a small price to pay to stop a fire or prevent a fire from happening. And I know some folks are probably going to throw into the chat, if I don't answer it right now, well, doesn't water react badly with lithium? That is true for lithium metal, but these batteries are lithium ion. So while dumping water on the batteries is going to ruin the batteries and render them useless, nothing else bad is going to happen. It's going to cool the batteries down, and then they're going to get disposed of properly. So I mentioned the first time you saw this chart, when it didn't have all of this wonderful information sticking off of it, that's what would happen if a battery is abused and there were no checks in place, right? But as you follow this around again now, from the 12 o'clock point all the way around, these are all of the checks and balances and safety features that will be in place for these systems based on the fire code. So all of these controls are essentially addressed in the chapter of the fire code in some way, shape, or form. So between the battery being abused at the top and then off gassing, overheating and off gassing over at like the 3 o'clock mark, this is what we're looking at is the green region, the preventative region, where you can stop the thermal runaway from happening, nip it in the bud, if you will. And some of the ways we do that is, of course, starting at the top with cell quality. Throughout the fire code, there are different, UL standards that the battery cells and the systems themselves also need to meet. So cell quality, obviously the best place to start. If you have good batteries, they're less likely to go bad. Fairly obvious. Moving along, environmental system controls like air conditioning, for example, within the systems to make sure that they're not overheating. And again, that battery management system, just working our way around. That's what I was describing earlier is the eyes, the ears, the brains of the system, monitoring all of these things and directing it what to do. If it's starting to get a little warm, you turn up the AC. If an individual cell is starting to malfunction and overheat, it can shut that cell down and isolate it from the rest of the system, and so on and so forth. So those are all, great preventative measures to begin with, but we didn't want to stop there because things can happen, things can go wrong. So in the event that does, in the unlikely event that the battery management system is not able to nip it in the bud, we have off-gas detection requirements. So if those cells are heating up and starting to off-gas, you have gas detectors in there that can notice that and set off alarms as well. Beyond that, say for whatever reason the off-gas detection fails, there's the temperature monitoring. So if it's starting to heat up in there, even if you're not noticing the gas, you're going to notice the temperature of them. Beyond that, working our way over to like the 6 o'clock mark, if you will, smoke detection, if you're starting to get to that point. All of these things are required in the fire code. Smoke detection, lower flammability limit gas detection. So maybe allowing buildup of some of that flammable off gassing to a certain point, but once it gets below the lower or above the lower flammability limit where it could possibly ignite, that could set off an alarm. There's exhaust and deflagration venting features built in so that if the gas is starting to build up, it can trigger an exhaust system that will start exhausting it, or, prevent an explosion from happening, basically is what deflagration venting is too. So if pressure is starting to build up in one of those containers, that venting can like pop open in response to that pressure buildup and get that gas out of there before anything happens. Again, should all of these wonderful safety features fail, of course, there are fire suppression systems that need to be in place as well. And beyond that, say a fire does occur, there's other safety features in place to make sure that that fire in one section of a battery energy storage system does not transfer itself to other parts of the battery energy storage system. So like dissipating any heat that does build up, or specifying the separation distance that needs to be between different blocks of batteries, or even different containers of batteries. For example, the fire code specifies how far apart they need to be so that if it happens to be a fire in one, it's at least not going to spread to the other, and it's going to be contained within itself. And that's what at the very top here, back to the 12 o'clock mark again, non-propagation design. So trying to keep everything that could go wrong, if it does go wrong, to a minimum, and not let it go beyond itself. Okay, so we'll dig into the 2020 fire code a little bit. I mentioned it has its own whole chapter for electrical energy storage systems now. It's section 1206, and that is essentially what's in chapter 4 of our energy storage guidebook for local governments on the website. So I'm just going to give you a little sneak peek into some parts that are, this is basically an excerpt from the fire code. All right. And for commercial systems, it's going to, the requirements that we talk about are going to apply to any system that exceeds these thresholds. So without going through all of them, for lithium ion batteries, anything over 20 kilowatt hours, it's going to trigger the requirements in this fire code. And that's a pretty small system. I would say residential size even. For larger systems, what we would have referred to as tier 2 in the model law, 600 kilowatt hours and above, there's going to be even more for them to do in the fire code. So those larger ones are going to have to go through a hazard mitigation analysis before being approved. So that analysis will look at, if there are failures that happen in the system, what are the consequences of those failures? And is it something, is it a reasonable risk, and it'll be okay, right? That's what this hazard mitigation analysis is trying to do. So it'll look at what happens if there's thermal runaway in a single energy storage system rack or a single energy storage system module. What will happen if the battery management system happens to fail? What will happen if the ventilation system fails? What if there's a voltage surge or a short circuit? What if the smoke, fire, or gas detection fails, et cetera? And based on the results of that fire or hazard mitigation analysis, it needs to show that if there is a fire, it will at least be contained for the minimum duration of the fire resistance ratings of the walls or the building for long enough to let any occupants that might be in there safely evacuate before it might get out of control. It also needs to demonstrate that any toxic gases that might be released during a fire will not reach concentrations in excess of a level that is dangerous to people that might be in the building before they have enough time to evacuate. And then finally, that any flammable gases will not exceed 25% of that lower flammability limit where they could potentially ignite, and that they'll be controlled through ventilation. So hazard mitigation analysis, basically looking at what happens when things that could go wrong, and making sure that it's a manageable risk. Those larger systems also need to undergo a large scale fire test, which was conducted in accordance with UL 9540A or an approved equivalent. I don't currently know of an approved equivalent, but the code's written that way, I guess, in the event that someone comes up with an approved equivalent after the fact. And basically what this test does is demonstrates that if there's a fire, it's not going to spread, and it will be contained similar to the hazard mitigation analysis results for the duration of the fire resistance rating of whatever the assemblies are. And based on the results of this large scale fire test, I don't know why my slides keep changing on their own. Based on the results of that large scale fire test, the fire code official can approve exceptions to certain requirements all throughout the code. And those are all outlined, like this is a part where, based on the results of the large scale fire test, the code official has the authority to make those sorts of decisions. What the large scale fire test is basically a laboratory forcing some of the systems into thermal runaway, purposely trying to make them catch fire, and then watching what happens. And so for one example, I mentioned minimum separation requirements earlier. If there's a section of the code that says you must space different blocks of batteries in each system at least 5 feet apart, if this large scale fire test shows that you can light 2 of them on fire within 3, or one of them on fire within 3 foot of another one, and it's not going to spread, the fire code official can use that information to say, okay, well, you can put them less than 5 feet together. You can put them 3 feet together because this large scale fire test that was conducted in a laboratory shows it to be safe. And here, maximum allowable quantities. This is just another excerpt from the code. It shows that there's a few types up top that have unlimited quantities that you can put in one given space. Lithium ion, the maximum is 600 kilowatt hours. You'll notice that is the same threshold that we used to separate our tier 1 and tier 2 systems in the model law. If anyone wants to go above 600 kilowatt hours, that's where you're triggering the requirements for this large scale fire test and the hazard mitigation analysis. And like I said, there are some exceptions throughout the code, and you can see in this red box on the left here. So the first example here is an exception to this maximum allowable quantities. So where approved by the fire code official, systems that exceed the amount in the table can be permitted based on the hazard mitigation analysis and large scale fire testing. So if they pass the test, you can do more than 600 kilowatt hours. And there are some other exceptions throughout the code as well. Number 2 here in the red box on the screen is very common for lead, acid, and nickel cadmium battery systems and facilities that are under the exclusive control of communications utilities. They have a lot of exceptions throughout the code. And I couldn't tell you the very scientific reasons why. I'm not a battery engineer, but I know that communications utilities have been having these large battery backup systems for many years, and they seem to have a decent track record. And I have to imagine that that comes into play for why they have this exception throughout the code. And the other exception for this maximum allowable quantities of 600 kilowatt hours for lithium ion batteries, in addition to the fire code official being able to allow larger quantities based on the results of the testing that we talked about on the last 2 slides, dedicated use buildings that have nothing in them except for batteries can also exceed those quantities. So if you have batteries in the basement of an office building where there's a bunch of people working, you're going to have to do that hazard mitigation analysis and the large scale fire testing and get that waiver from the code official. If you build a large building out in the middle of nowhere that doesn't have any people in it, or, you know, homes nearby or anything like that, just a dedicated use building, nothing batteries, the code allows the quantities to be more than 600 kilowatt hours. All right, we've talked about this a few times now, but battery energy storage management system, again, eyes, ears, brains, it's capable of not just noticing issues, but rectifying issues and alerting folks of issues all at the same time. I'll just summarize it like that because I don't want us to accidentally go over our time. This example, I already alluded to a little bit here. So for any of the larger energy storage systems, the fire code requires that they be in blocks of batteries, no more than 50 kilowatt hours per block. And each of those blocks needs to be spaced at least 3 feet apart from each other and also from the walls, as you can see in the diagram here. And this is, like I said, one of those examples where, based on that large scale fire testing in the red box on the bottom here, the fire code official can say, okay, I see the results show 100 kilowatt hour blocks 3 feet apart are shown to be safe. So yes, you can do that. Or they might see as a result that 50 kilowatt hour blocks spaced 2 feet apart are fine. So they have a little bit of wiggle room there based on the results of the testing. But the default in the code is what you see here on the screen. There's also a maximum enclosure size. So outdoor systems throughout the code have slightly less strict requirements than systems that are located in buildings. So there's a maximum enclosure size that it can be and still be considered a quote unquote outdoor unit. If it gets any bigger than that maximum enclosure size, it's basically just going to be treated as a building in the fire code, and whatever indoor requirements are in there would apply. So this is just the largest an enclosure can be for an outdoor system before it starts to be considered an indoor system. It's basically the size of a shipping container, the volume of a shipping container anyway. Some more examples of some of those safety features that are included in the code. Alluded to it a little bit, but if you have an energy storage system that might release toxic gas during the charging, discharging, and normal use, they need to have a hazardous exhaust system. As it turns out, lithium ion batteries are not one of those types of batteries. They don't off gas during the normal charging and discharging. They only off gas if something goes wrong. So this is one of those parts of the code that would not apply to lithium ion batteries, but that doesn't mean that a lithium ion energy storage system wouldn't have some type of exhaust, because they might have it installed anyway as a form of explosion control, like we were talking about before. If gases start to build up to a certain amount, there needs to be some sort of explosion control in place. So it could be an exhaust system or that deflagration venting that I was talking about before, which is basically panels that open when they're triggered by too much pressure in the space. There's a fire remediation section of the code. We really like this part. It basically puts the onus on the owner of the system to deal with an incident after the fact. And so the fire, the first responders might show up and deal with an incident right away. But also the owner needs to have some sort of expert that's going to show up or be available to help the first responders or answer questions they may have. And that's part of the signage requirements in the code, is having that emergency contact information that the first responders can call as soon as they get there. In addition to the owner having to dispatch fire mitigation personnel to respond to the scene in a timely manner to help out as well. The other thing that's great about this section of the fire code is the fact that they can relieve the fire department once the fire is out. No one wants the fire department to be out of service and sitting around and babysitting the battery system until it's decommissioned. And the reason that that's a concern is because batteries, they have a lot of energy in them. And even if they had caught fire, maybe not all of the energy was dissipated. So you can snuff out the flames, but then maybe a few hours later, they start to heat up again, and they can reignite hours after the fact, basically. So you don't want the first responders to have to sit around and babysit the batteries to make sure that they're not going to catch on fire hours later. So that is absolutely the responsibility of the energy storage system owner to send someone out there, relieve the fire department, be there to make sure nothing happens until it can be properly decommissioned and disposed of. So we like this. Another snapshot of the code and some of the different compliance requirements that apply based on technology type. So there's battery technology types across the top, sort of labeling the columns going down, and the rows going across are showing what type of compliance is required based on that battery technology. So I alluded to this a minute ago, but if you look at the first row here, exhaust ventilation, you'll see that yes, it's required for lead acid. Yes, it's required for nickel cadmium and nickel metal hydride, but it is not required for lithium ion. And that's because, like I mentioned in the previous slide, lithium ion batteries do not off gas as part of their normal operation. They would only off gas if something was going wrong. So they don't need this just normal exhaust ventilation kind of going all the time like lead acid would, for example, that are just off gassing constantly as part of how they function. However, if you skip down 2 rows to explosion control, you will see, and move over to the lithium ion column, you will see that explosion control is absolutely required for lithium ion because they can off gas when something goes wrong. And one way that you can meet the explosion control requirement in the fire code is by using exhaust ventilation. So you might see it with them, you might not, you probably will though. I think most of these systems are going to have some sort of exhaust no matter what. We're not going to go through every component of this because it's not fire code training, but I like to show folks snippets of what's in there. A little more detail on the exhaust ventilation. Like I've mentioned before, when that requirement is triggered, it's designed to limit the concentration of flammable gas to 25% of that lower flammability limit, or they can meet that obligation by just having a certain rate of continuous ventilation all the time. And if there's an exhaust ventilation system, it needs to have its own standby power for up to 2 hours. In case something goes wrong, you can at least still keep ventilating it. And the exhaust ventilation, just like the rest of the system, needs to be supervised by a central or remote station. It would be the same one that the battery management system is connected to, where it's going to send alert signals if anything goes wrong. Similarly, needs to be a gas detector in there to be able to trigger that ventilation system, right? And also transmit audible and visible alarms to an approved location. You don't want any of these alarms just going off in the place where the batteries are, because many of these systems are not going to have humans around them at all times. So anytime there's an alarm, it should be going to some approved central location, likely elsewhere. The spill control and neutralization. This is not a requirement that applies to lithium-ion batteries, but the fire code covers all of the different technologies, and some batteries have liquid electrolytes in them, which presents the opportunity for a spill if something goes wrong. So for those batteries, one of the safety compliance mechanisms that's in the fire code is spill control. So they need to have some sort of containment under the batteries in case there is a spill to catch it, not just catch the liquid, but neutralize it to an appropriate pH level as well. Explosion control. I've touched on this a couple times because I know it's a very hot topic. Deflagration venting is those pressure panels that I keep mentioning, or I've mentioned a few times at least anyway, and you can see them in the images on the right. And again, they're designed so that if there's enough buildup of gas and pressure in the enclosed space, they can direct an explosion out to where it is not going to hit people. For example, like we saw in Arizona a couple years ago, or a few years ago, I guess at this point, you don't want any explosions coming out the doors where first responders might be trying to enter. If there's going to be an explosion, you want it directed in a place where nobody's going to get hurt, and that would most likely be on the top of the containers, right? So 2 options for explosion control. And again, this does apply to lithium ion. You can either have that deflagration venting to direct explosions where you want them to go, or deflagration prevention, which again is why you might see exhaust even in lithium ion systems, because if something's going wrong, they might start exhausting or off gassing rather. So you want exhaust fans that will keep that off gassing to 25% of the lower flammability limit to prevent explosions from happening in the first place. There are fire suppression, of course, fire suppression requirements in the code. Like I said, water is definitely the best way to stop thermal runaway from happening, but you might see a combined system of fire suppression in some of these systems too, because it's not just batteries that are in there, right? There's the battery management system, and there are other things that could potentially, be sparking and catching a fire. So a non-water based fire suppression system might work in that case. So you could see the non-water based system sort of go off first if something goes wrong, to snuff out the flames. If the flames happen to have been coming from batteries and you need to cool them down, you might have the water system be designed to be triggered next if needed. So you could have one or the other or both, depending on how it's designed. I alluded to this before, but throughout the fire code, the requirements for the systems differ based on not just the technology type, like we've seen in some of the charts so far, but also where they're located. So a dedicated use building, it's designed to do nothing but hold batteries for the most part. It's going to have less restrictions on it than a non-dedicated use building that also has human occupants inside. The non-dedicated use building is going to have the most stringent requirements of all. Outdoor systems in general are going to have a little bit more leniency than any of the indoor systems, but outdoors that are near exposures. So if they're near another building within, I think it's 100 feet of anything that could potentially catch fire, a building, you know, certain types of trees, for example, or fencing, anything like that. If it's near an exposure, it's going to have more strict requirements to meet than if it's an outdoor system that's remotely located and not near anything that's going to catch fire near it. Just an example of some of the walk-in containers that these would be considered outdoor systems because they're still within that maximum enclosure size that we saw earlier. We refer to them as a walk-in container. It's not a building. It's just an example of seeing some of the pieces of the code applied to a real life project here. So you see that maximum enclosure size is about the size of a shipping container. Working down the left-hand side here, there are certain requirements for egress paths throughout the codes. You can see they have a nice wide walkway to get away from things if need be. And that particular arrow on the bottom left there is pointing to 2 people. I don't know how big your screens are, but those are 2 people walking in green vests for scale. Working up to the top right side of the screen, there are security requirements in the code as well, fencing, so you can see that going all around the perimeter to prevent anyone from getting near it. You can see the HVAC units on the top of the walk-in containers, making sure that they're temperature regulated and keeping those batteries happy. Can also see an example of the exhaust ventilation on them. And this is, for scale, about 120 megawatts worth of batteries here. This is a bird's eye sort of cutaway view of what it might look like on the inside of one of these. You can see all of the battery racks, which are like the black boxes that are taking up the vast majority of the space, but you're also going to see the fire suppression system. Could be a clean agent, like I said before, could be water, could be a combination of both. The energy management system might be in there, might be located just outside the box if it's shared with some of the other containers. You're going to see the HVAC, battery control panel, inverters, some more context of examples of energy storage system cabinets. These would be, again, about the size of a refrigerator. This is what we'd refer to as a cabinet, unlike these walk-in units. This is just some of the terminology. Cabinets, no people are going to be entering them. It's what it sounds like. You open a little door and you can access everything you need and no one ever has to go inside of them. Cabinet system, if you string a bunch of them together, might look something like that. I mentioned outdoor installations have some different requirements from indoor installations. And I think someone might have been asking about this. I know we've asked about it a lot. What can they be near? What should they not be near? Any outdoor installations should have at least 10 feet of clearance from any lot lines, public ways, buildings, combustibles, things that can catch fire, basically any other hazards needs to be at least 10 feet away. And this is one of those instances where the clearance can be reduced to 3 feet by the fire code official if you do certain things. So if you put a 1 hour fire barrier all around that system, you could reduce the clearance to 3 feet instead of 10. I won't go through every single exception here, but I think the point of this here is to illustrate some of the other exceptions that you might see throughout the code. For exterior wall installations, I think you'd see this mostly in a residential setting. The maximum capacity of each unit is 20 kilowatt hours. That's maybe about the size of what this Tesla pack on the wall is, or a little bit bigger. 20 kilowatt hours might be a little larger actually than the one in the photo here. If you're going to hang more than one unit, they need to be separated by at least 3 feet. So again, and that's the protection so that if something does go wrong with one, it's not going to propagate to the one next to it because 3 feet is enough space to not allow it to propagate. And then finally, they need to be at least 5 feet from doors, windows, any openings or HVAC inlets into the building, because if that does start to off gas or if it does catch fire, you don't want the gas going into the building or the flames licking into it too. So separated from each other and separated from any, basically any inlets to the building. All right, so that was just real quick touching on the fire code, going through the model law, giving you a little bit of a taste of everything energy storage. If you found that to be interesting, good for you. You're probably a little bit of a nerd like me, and I would encourage you to sign up and attend the energy storage for first responders session, where we'll cover all of that and more. And that is all I have for now, finishing a little bit early, unless we probably have some questions.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? There hasn't been any that have come in the Q&A or chat since the last ones, but if folks have questions, please add them to the chat box now. In the meantime, I did drop in the chat box the links that are on this page, as well as the email address that Jen provided. And the link to our final training in this series that Jen just mentioned, and this is the energy storage for first responders. This will be taking place on June 14th. This is going to be the only training that's actually going to be in person. It's going to be at the Farm and Home Center at 1 p.m. on the 14th.
I think I'm doing that one, actually.
But you are doing that one. So you'll get to see Jen again. But I highly encourage you to share that information about this training with code enforcement officers, building and or fire safety inspectors, first responders and incident response personnel, and any other related positions in your community. Help us get the word out to those appropriate audiences, so that not only you know this information, but the first responders, the code enforcement officers, and other relevant personnel in your community are informed and aware of this information as well.
Yeah, and code officials get free continuing ed credits through Department of State for that one too.
Excellent, yeah. So we did get a question about certificates. Please, so, and I also see someone didn't get a previous certificate. I got a message during this, I believe, for the solar training. I'll follow up with Shelby and the Department of Planning about that, but please feel free. I'll put my email address in here right now. If you did not get previous training certificates from the 2 trainings that have already passed, feel free to send me an email now or tomorrow, and I will follow up with the Department of Planning to find out about those and then get back to you. But for everyone who is attending tonight, I'm looking for a certificate of attendance so that you can take it back to your town to get credit for your planning department or your town board or those types of things. In about a week to 2 weeks time, you will be hearing from the Department of Planning. So you'll be hearing from them twice. First, you'll get an email in about a week's time with a link to the recording of this webinar. We will post that for you so that you can go back to it or share it with your colleagues if you found it very useful. We'll also provide you a copy of the slides as a PDF. As well as the links that Jen shared in her presentation and that have been shared in the chat throughout the evening. So you'll get that email first, and then a couple of days to a week after that, you will get an individual email with a certificate of attendance, specifically with your name on it from the Department of Planning. So those just take a little bit longer to generate, and that's why it takes about a week and a half sometimes to get those out, because they're individually emailed. If you don't receive that in about 2 weeks time, please feel free to reach out to myself and Shelby. That's the contact information that's been shared as part of the registration process and the announcements about this training series. But any other additional questions for Jen on the content? You did a very thorough job tonight, Jen. It was great. It was fantastic. And I know I appreciate it. And like I had mentioned to you previously, we've been getting tons of really great feedback about this whole training series and all the content that you all have been sharing with folks. So thank you so much.
Even if folks don't take too much away from the trainings, other than to know that the resources were out there and who to call, I'm happy about it.
Yeah, we've already got a comment, no questions, but a big thank you. This was great. Thank you
you.
for sharing that, Paula. Yeah, and don't forget, and we'll reshare this, but Jen mentioned they have that email address that goes to every member of the clean energy siting team. And from what I understand, you all are extremely responsive in getting back to communities about questions and information that communities need to move forward with these
We
things.
do our best. If anything does fall through the crack, don't be afraid to harass us, though.
We got multiple thank yous in the chat. Let's give folks maybe one more minute to put a question in the chat. I know sometimes it takes a while to type those out. I'm the slowest typer in the world, so I understand that. But yeah, otherwise we will wrap this training up for again. Don't forget to sign up for the June 14th training that will be in the Farm and Home Center. For anyone who is worried about COVID, you're more than welcome to wear a mask, and we've opened up the entire meeting room, so we'll have a very large space so people can socially distance if they're interested to keep themselves safe, but it will be at 1 p.m. at the Farm and Home Center, and look forward to seeing Jen there and learning even more about battery energy storage, again, with a specific focus on information for first responders.
To be fair, a lot of it is going through the fire code in detail, but there's a good amount for first responders too. As it turns out, it's really hard to change the title of a course after you've registered it with Department of State. So yeah,
Gotcha.
It does focus pretty heavily on the code.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jen. Thank you to your entire team at NYSERDA for all of this information and all your hard work on this. Thank you once again to Dutchess County Planning Department for organizing this entire series as part of the Clean Energy Communities program. And thank you again to the Hudson Valley Regional Council for this support. And thank you to all of you for attending. I know Shelby and I were very excited that so many of your communities were interested in this information, and we think it's really inspiring. We've had 17 or more communities represented at each of these trainings throughout the series, which I think is fantastic. So thank you all and have a great night.
Yeah, thank you for hosting.
You're welcome. Have a great night, everyone.